December 1980, the political columnist Peter Jenkins wrote his pre-Christmas column and said that at all the Christmas parties at Westminster, there was only one topic under discussion, and that topic was Tony Benn. It is difficult now to recall the degree to which Tony Benn became a dominant figure in British politics. And remember, in December 1980, there were plenty of other things for politicians and journalists to gossip about at Westminster Christmas parties. Not least Margaret Thatcher had just become Prime Minister. Well, she'd been around for a few months by then, 18 months or so. And yet Tony Benn was the dominant talking point. And there was a great sense at the time that for good or for bad, Peter Jenkins was one of those who emphatically thought it was for the bad. Tony Benn was the left-wing counter to Margaret Thatcher. He was the left-wing change-maker in the way that she had been on the right, with the difference that quite a lot of the Labour Party didn't think he could win an election. Mind you, many in the Tory party didn't think Thatcher could before she did in '79. The context in which Jenkins wrote that article was extraordinary. After the 1979 election, Tony Benn announced that he wouldn't be standing for the shadow cabinet. Labour had been booted out of power, and that instead he was going to tour the country and reflect on how Labour needed to change. And boy did he tour, and boy did he reflect on how Labour needed to change. There were moments when the right-wing newspapers feared and the left hoped that Tony Benn would be a leader of the Labour Party and therefore a potential Prime Minister. There were quite a few periods when Tony Benn was seen as a potential Prime Minister. Early on in his career, he was a dynamic, modern politician. He briefed the likes of Hugh Gaitskell in the late 1950s how to project onto television, then a relatively new political medium. In the mid-70s, if we fast forward to then, when Tony Benn had become this fully formed left-wing rebel within his own cabinet, a despairing Jim Callaghan as Prime Minister said to Tony Benn, "You will be leader of this party, Tony, but you will lead it into opposition for many, many years." But it's another example as to how he was seen as a potential leader. And then in that period around 1980, when Peter Jenkins wrote his Christmas column, he was at his mesmeric peak. He was the great orator of that period. He could make a spellbinding speech in the House of Commons or at a packed public meeting like no other. And there were indeed, in that period, endless columns and a mountain of speculation about what would happen to Tony Benn and whether he would indeed lead the Labour Party at some point. It never did happen, and yet Benn's impact in politics was great from the very beginning. And in a way, it was at the beginning that Benn became defined in his radicalism. Later on, there was quite a lot of focus on his views about the economy, the role of trade unions, the role of the state in running public services, the role of the Labour Party in its relationship with the leadership. All these were big concerns of Benn, but his first great battle of historic significance defined him. And the battle arose in 1961 when his father died. His father had been given an hereditary peerage, and Benn inherited it. He was an MP. and Ben didn't want it. He wanted to stay in the House of Commons. Now, most people would just accept their fate and take these things and go on into the House of Lords. Not Tony Benn. He took to the streets of his constituency in Bristol. He fought a campaign. He fought and won a by-election, which he himself had triggered because he was meant to be in the House of Lords. And in the end, he changed the legislation. Even though a Conservative government was in power at the time, he brought about a change, which many people subsequently took use of, including quite a few Tories who were about to inherit peerages or had already done so and wanted to go back to the Commons. And Ben learnt a huge amount from that early campaign. He learnt, perhaps to an exaggerated extent, the power of the public speech. It was him campaigning, and you could still see it on YouTube, him with a tannoy going round in a van, arguing that the people's vote is what mattered and he had been elected and should have the right to stand. So he took away from it the power of the public meeting. He took away, too, the centrality of constitutional issues in determining what happens in a country. From that moment on, he became fascinated by and driven by accountability. Who are you accountable to? He was defiant in his opposition to the unelected House of Lords, and he began to formulate a set of questions which he posed again and again. Who put so-and-so in power? He would begin. He would then ask a series of other questions and end by saying, and how do we get rid of them? And in asking those questions, Ben began to make his various other significant moves. In the 64 to 70 Harold Wilson Labour government, he became gradually disillusioned with the lack of radical ambition. And when they were kicked out in 1970, he began to think that the most important way in which a Labour government can be radical is to almost compel it to be. And that meant making it more accountable to its members, giving more power to its governing body, the National Executive Committee. It was during this period, too, that Tony Benn, who had been a pro-European, turned against Europe on the grounds of this issue of accountability. And when Ted Heath took us into Europe, Benn, like the Labour leadership, but not all of its parliamentary party, opposed membership. And this brought about Benn's second significant contribution, historic, with profound consequences to this very day. Labour was split over whether Britain should stay in the common market, as it was then called. They were as profoundly split in the early to mid-1970s as the Conservative Party has been since the early 1990s. And in the cabinet, there were intense disagreements when Labour got back into power in February 1974. Imagine what it must have been like for the Prime Minister Harold Wilson, a leader of a minority government with a cabinet split. Think of Theresa May. And Wilson didn't quite know what to do about it. And it was Tony Benn who suggested that he hold a referendum on Britain's continuing membership of the common market, as it was then called. And in the end, after much reluctance, Wilson took on the idea. And Jim Callaghan said at a cabinet meeting, Tony Benn has perhaps given us a life raft on which we can all leap aboard. It did indeed unite the cabinet briefly, in that they all supported the referendum. Then they all went their different ways in the referendum campaign. When Benn was proposing the referendum, he thought he would win. Polls suggested a majority of voters wanted us out of the common market. But he lost. He lost by a huge margin. An early example, again, I think, of Tony Benn's capacity to misread public opinion, to take an optimistic view that his thoughts and ideas were those that the majority would back. And so he lost. And with a ruthlessness that David Cameron was unable to show because he lost a referendum, he moved Tony Benn. Tony Benn had been a radical industry secretary seeking much wider state ownership, workers on boards and so on. He moved him to become energy secretary. But Benn was so energetic, so fascinated by politics, that he didn't sulk. He was furious with Wilson for moving him, but he just got on with it and immersed himself in that job. It's very interesting in modern politics. We hear complaints about cabinet ministers not being loyal to Theresa May, publicly speaking out. Well, Tony Benn really tested the loyalty of the latest Prime Minister, Jim Callaghan. Tony Benn was in the cabinet and also on Labour's ruling National Executive Committee. And there were times when on that National Executive Committee, he voted against his own government's policy, to the fury of Jim Callaghan. But such was his following, such was his command in parts of the Labour Party, Jim Callaghan didn't dare sack him. And Benn remained in the cabinet until 79, when he then left the front bench to go on his mesmerising tour. And again, really, his tour was about accountability and constitutional reform. He wasn't uninterested in economics. Indeed, he was the pioneer of what became known as the alternative economic strategy, a left-wing policy of some protectionism and wide state ownership and a whole range of different ideas, high levels of public spending and investment. And he had put that forward when he was a cabinet minister and subsequently. But what fascinated him was this. He felt the Labour leadership in government was too accountable to a right-wing media, a civil service that was small c conservative, a parliamentary party that could be small c conservative, and he wanted the leadership to become accountable to the membership and campaigned accordingly. The peak for him, and this is where we do need to consider him in this series of potential leaders and therefore prime ministers, was when he contested the 1981 deputy leadership campaign. He had already had a huge impact on the internal politics of the Labour Party. Labour MPs alone had elected the leader of their party. Tony Benn was the leader in changing all that, and in a whole series of radical reforms, the party membership, the trade unions and MPs as only one bloc were to elect any future leader and deputy leader. And Benn wanted to try out this new system in 1981. So he stood against Dennis Healey, the then deputy leader. The SDP had already formed, and the then leader of the Labour Party, Michael Foot, pleaded with Tony Benn not to stand. He said it would be utterly divisive and only help the Tories, but he went for it. And he began well behind in the internal Labour Party polling, but with astonishing verve and energy. He was quite seriously ill in the middle of the contest. He fought an extraordinary campaign. Whatever you think of the arguments and the policies advanced, he did it with charisma and oratory that hadn't been seen for quite some time in British politics, and the audiences adored him. And incidentally, a regular attender at these meetings in the build-up to the deputy leadership contest in 1981 was Jeremy Corbyn. Corbyn, as I shall go on to reflect shortly, adored Tony Benn. And to understand Corbyn, you would need to understand Tony Benn. As it was, Benn just lost the deputy leadership campaign to Denis Healey. It was by less than 1%. If you watch on YouTube, you can see the result being announced. It's a moment of great significance for the Labour Party and British politics. Arguably, if Tony Benn had won, there would have been many more defections to the SDP. But in the light of what's happened to Jeremy Corbyn, you never know quite what the electoral impact might have been. But Benn took it graciously. You can see him writing down, smiling, the result, and congratulated Healey after a campaign of intense and sometimes rather nasty politics. That was the peak for Tony Benn in terms of his battles within the Labour Party and his chances of getting the crown. He did make one more leadership challenge. He loved leadership contests. He once wrote in his, dictated, because he didn't write them, once dictated in his diaries when Harold Wilson resigned in '76. On the day of the resignation, it's about 3 a.m, Benn was there saying to his diary, he said, well, Harold's resigned, which I suppose means there's going to be a leadership contest, and I'm just so excited. I just love leadership contests. And he fought another one against Neil Kinnock and was slaughtered. Kinnock beat him easily, and it was a sort of sad final contest for Tony Benn, because it illustrated that his time in that context had gone. It raises, though, an interesting question. Why was it that Benn failed to secure the leadership of the Labour Party when Jeremy Corbyn, many years later, 2015, succeeded? Corbyn, I think Corbyn would be the first to admit it, does not have some of the qualities that Benn possessed. Benn had been an experienced cabinet minister. Jeremy Corbyn had been on the backbenches all the way through. Benn had language like few others. Indeed, one of the similarities between him and Margaret Thatcher, and they curiously admired each other for this, is that they saw the role of senior politicians partly as being teachers. While Thatcher was leader of the opposition in the 70s, many Labour figures were dismissive of her. Benn wasn't. He disagreed with her, but noted in his diaries her qualities as a teacher. And she knew, and I'll come on to this shortly, that Benn had those same qualities. It wasn't all that they had other things in common. And Jeremy Corbyn doesn't really have that verve and wit and range that Benn had. As I say, he was at every meeting I ever went to see Tony Benn speak, and so I'm sure he would acknowledge that. And yet it was Corbyn who won and not Benn. And here I think is another of our lessons from the prime ministers we never had. That in a way, cabinet experience, if you're from a radical wing in politics, can be a disadvantage to some extent. Tony Benn, while commanding an admiration and adoration as great as Jeremy Corbyn in his role as Labour leader, was also a member of the cabinet that he was implicitly and sometimes explicitly attacking, and I think that was constraining. I think it also tells us about the mood of our times. Even though Tony Benn was in many ways this more compelling and better known figure than Jeremy Corbyn, something changed in British politics after the 2008 financial crash. British politics since then has been utterly turbulent and unpredictable. We've had a coalition. We've had 2 historic referendums, the one in Scotland triggering a rise of nationalism, the one on Europe triggering Brexit. We've had unexpected general election outcomes, one after another. We've had a Prime Minister, Cameron, who unexpectedly won a majority in 2015 and was gone within a year. British politics has become far more unruly in recent years. Now, in the 1980s and early 80s, when Benn might have peaked, it was unquestionably turbulent, but Thatcherism had sort of prevailed in '79 and was beginning to reshape the economic landscape and to some extent the electoral landscape. There was no talk of a new political party because there was a new political party. The SDP was threatening to suck the life out of Labour. And so the context was less propitious for this formidable figure of the left. But here is another twist with Benn. While I think, on reflection, of the prime ministers we never had that we're looking at, he probably, of all of them, had less chance of being prime minister. It's quite hard to see the moment when he becomes prime minister in his political career for all the qualities I've described. And yet this is the twist. I think of all the prime ministers we never had, some of his ideas and arguments are more enduring than any of the others. Obviously, and we've reflected briefly on this, the rise of Corbyn. Corbyn is sometimes called a Trotskyite, a Stalinist, or he's a Bennite. Corbyn's mission is to implement the policies of Tony Benn within the Labour Party and beyond. Hence, within the Labour Party, the focus on powers for party members. Outside the Labour internal structures, Corbyn's passion for unilateralism, a degree of state ownership, and indeed, in the past, Corbyn's opposition to Europe. Tony Benn remained a profound opponent of Europe, and I think it's one of the reasons why Jeremy Corbyn struggled to put the case for Remain. He was conscious that Tony Benn would have been on the other side. And that brings us to another influence. The arguments Benn deployed against Europe didn't win in 1975. He was slaughtered by the Staying In campaign. But they resonate now. And they resonate, and here is the biggest twist of the lot, as much in the Conservative Party as in Labour, in some ways more so. During the Maastricht debates in the 1990s in the Commons, Benn was still a great speaker from the back benches, and when he spoke against Maastricht and highlighted what he saw as the lack of accountability in Europe, one of the figures from the other side, nodding away very ostentatiously, was Margaret Thatcher. She agreed with him and occasionally cheered the end of his speeches, which was a sight worth seeing, given that Benn was the demon of the Conservative Party in the 70s and 80s. But he's had much more impact on the Conservative Party than that. The whole focus on the Conservative Party has shifted from an unswerving loyalty to leadership to, in some cases, unswerving loyalty to local parties. There are some Conservative MPs who say actively, we don't take our orders from leaders, we listen to our party members and our constituents. This is a form of Bennism. And when I wrote an article for a national newspaper a few years ago saying Conservative MPs have become Bennites, I got a call from a very senior figure from the Conservative Party, then a senior minister in that coalition government, saying that that was spot on and why the Conservative Party had indeed become so difficult to manage. So, in a curious way, one of Benn's regular comments that you begin with an idea and people think you're mad, then they begin to wonder whether you might have a point, and then they pretend that they claim the idea in the first place. That sequence has happened with him, in that those who condemned him as mad and dangerous now adopt some of his principled ideas. I think there were other reasons why he never got to the very top. And that is about working with colleagues. Ben was always genuinely charming and witty, and Harold Wilson's senior advisor, Marcia Williams, adored him. Wilson couldn't bear him by the end. And Wilson went on to say, the thing about Tony Benn is that he immatured with age. And Wilson, who began by being a great admirer, saw him in the end as a sort of adolescent figure. Dennis Healy, who was instinctively sort of quite a benevolent character for all his boisterous reputation, found him almost impossible to deal with. And there was a lot of talk about him not being a team player. Now, Tony Benn would argue that ideas and policies and debate matter much more than suppressing your views in order to maintain a collective facade of unity. But in the end, some of those who became prime ministers were far less animating and interesting as politicians, but they did keep to that rule of collective responsibility. They might not have been brilliant teachers, they might not have excited crowds and audiences, but they had that trust beyond their core internal support. Still, I think Tony Benn had no regrets, because he continued doing what he had done since that very early campaign to renounce the peerage, and that is going around the country speaking, his great love. He even spoke towards the end of his life at Glastonbury, as Jeremy Corbyn did, where he too was treated like a rock star. And every twist and turn has been chronicled. His final and perhaps most important contribution in his diaries. So people can decide for themselves, in diaries which I think incidentally are largely reliable, although subjective, whether they believe, as some Labour MPs do, that he was responsible for their 18 years of opposition, or whether he was a radical reformer of historic significance with ideas that live on today.